10 years ago, the FCC slapped several networks with big fines after Cher and Bono dropped a few F-bombs during an awards ceremony. The FCC has since backed off fining broadcasters for what it calls fleeting expletives, but still the threat lingers. Not so for cable networks, which are exempt from profanity rules. And that made us wonder why CNN bleeped so much language during the George Zimmerman trial. For the past several weeks, CNN has been carrying live coverage of the trial of George Zimmerman, accused of gunning down an unarmed teenager. Zimmerman made a phone call to police just before the shooting, a tape that was played at trial.
Do you recognize that voice?
Yes.
And who is that voice is saying, pardon my language?
So what was that language anyway? Let's try that again.
I can play it again if you want.
Huh? CNN blanked out about a third of the tape recording, prompting Ashley Banfield to explain.
Yes, CNN bleeps out the language, and we are sorry to do so because it is so germane to the argument today.
If it's so germane, why didn't they air it? CNN is a cable network and unrestricted by the FCC. In fact, when one of the lawyers repeated the words, CNN aired it, but we can't.
But you couldn't even hear the words punks on that?
If it's part of a transcript and not gratuitous, it should make air. And apparently FCC Chairman Julius Genachowski agrees. After David Ortiz dropped an F-bomb during a live broadcast, Genachowski wrote this. David Ortiz spoke from the heart at today's Red Sox game. I stand with Big Papi and the people of Boston. Say no more. Well, I'm really curious to know what CNN was thinking, because I went back and looked at some other instances. There was one where Susan Candiotti was reading a transcript, or actually it was a Facebook post from somebody charged in that racial murder in Oklahoma, I think it was, and she read word for word what this guy had posted on his Facebook, which included the F-bomb, and she spoke it right into camera. Here you have a trial where you're playing an audio tape that is, as Ashley Banfield said, so germane to the case, and you're not going to let the audience hear it, and you're not going to be sued if you do? Well, I don't understand it. And over and over and again, they were doing it.
There's a long-standing tradition that media feel a certain paternalistic need to protect their audience from vulgarities, from violent imagery. It is a moral choice, but it's also a news judgment choice, because by doing that, you change the way that people perceive the story. From my perspective, CNN should have aired it. From my perspective, CNN probably shouldn't be airing countless hours of the George Zimmerman trial. They should be paying attention to Egypt, but that's a separate debate.
That's because Whitey is not available.
That's right. But fundamentally, I mean, I looked it up after David Ortiz dropped his F-bomb. There were still complaints to the FCC. 24 Americans wrote into the FCC to complain about how culture had been, civilization had been destroyed by the fact that a man said a word that began with the letter F. From my perspective, I think we can all be adults, and news organizations should realize if it's important to the story, it's important to the story.
That's really the key factor. Is it germane? Can you tell the story effectively without quoting directly from what's going on? I think clearly in this case, the answer was no. I think the reason why CNN did it is CNN's feed goes outside the cable world. There are actually a lot of over-the-air broadcast stations that would use CNN's feed. So they probably felt that they had to do it. But I think CNN could have left that up to the individual stations that use it if that was a particular case. But you know, this argument goes back, I'm sure it goes back even further, but this came up when the transcripts from the White House, from the Oval Office when Richard Nixon was the president, and the whole argument came up over Watergate. And there were a lot of what we now refer to as F-bombs that came out of the President of the United States' mouth. And there was grave concern in the news media back in, was it 1972, about whether we should actually quote the President of the United States using the F-bomb word. And a lot of hand-wringing that went on. A few did. Great consternation when they did. Most chose not to. I think we've moved a long way since then. When Big Papi can do it, you know,
I think context is everything, and I can actually understand like bleeping David Ortiz. If you think it's something that a 7-year-old could be watching, I think it's understandable to potentially want to not have certain kinds of words included yet, and to not have those kids running around then and having those words as part of their vocabulary. I think when you look at CNN, a couple of good things have been pointed out. One is this is integral to what is happening on screen. The other thing is they're showing a murder trial. If a 7-year-old is sitting at home during the day watching the George Zimmerman murder trial, I think they can probably handle this word because we've got bigger problems. And then I think the final thing is exactly what Josh said, which is what they're doing in terms of airing this trial and giving it this kind of attention, I find to be incredibly questionable. And the amount of reliance that we have now on these sort of endless court trials to fill the days as if there's actually no news going on is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But if you're going to air it, fine.
Just on that, before we get to John, Jeff Zucker, who now runs CNN, actually had the gall today to say, I think we struck a perfect balance between our coverage of the George Zimmerman trial and our coverage of Egypt.
I'll translate for you. Our ratings are a little higher.
Right.
Well, I'm going to sort of agree with everything that's been said here about the profanity issue, but I want to disagree with everyone about CNN focusing on that trial. I think this trial is an incredibly important news story. Consider some of the issues that are at play here. The state of race relations and racial tension in America. The agony that many African Americans feel over the kind of daily indignities and the judgments and the profiling that they have to deal with. The anger and frustration of non-African Americans over having racial issues injected into what to many should be just a case of what really happened. I think it's important and it merits wall-to-wall coverage, whereas I agree with you, there are some trials that don't,
Okay,
but this one does.
Good point, but if it was about all that, let's hear the words that George Zimmerman was using to describe Trayvon Martin, because otherwise we wouldn't know there was that racially charged.
No argument there.
It deserves wall-to-wall coverage on headline news, while CNN can deal with other issues.
All right.